don't make any apology, by the way, for being gloomy. I think that if the facts are gloomy, you should be gloomy. And I think a huge amount of damage has been done historically and is still being done today by optimists.
I'll have to fight back.
But we might get onto that.
We will.
My view is that, that our continent is in the business of bullet dodging these days, and every time a bullet sort of whizzes past its head, we think, oh, well, it hasn't hit, so it'll be fine for another day. And I think that isn't true, but I think that the real problems are far deeper than the issues that any one election throws up these days, or any one challenger can throw up. My book's about what I see as being the two twin challenges that have come simultaneously. The first is the mass movement of peoples into Europe. And the second is that this should come at the same time that Europeans have lost the sense of what we are, or what we're meant to be, or whether we're allowed to be, or whether we are just the place where anyone in the world who wants to call our continent home can call it home. And I think this is a massive historical issue that's far beyond, at the moment, the grasp of any politicians in our country to deal with. But it'll be the one that galvanizes us, I think, throughout our lives.
And instead of Europe having a philosophy in which says if you're here, then you're European, and you can call yourself and think of yourself as being at home, what do you think should be the approach instead?
Well, it would start by recognizing that it isn't the case that anyone in the world who walks into Europe immediately becomes a European. Our historical reasons for getting to some of the ideas we have about separation of church and state, about our wounded attitude towards religion, our attitudes towards politics, in my view, are highly unlikely to just be picked up and arrived at exactly the same moment as we're at by millions of people coming into our continent. And I think that all of our political leaders massively underestimated this, and it may well be impossible to reverse that. First of all, the point that Christine makes does not prove the case, of course, does it? Because a lot of the areas where people don't like the diversity, shall we say, is because they've had enough of the diversity. It's not because they've never tried it. They've tried it and don't like it. And they go to areas where they can not have more of it thrown down their throat. And that's one of the big issues, isn't it? That everyone who's for the, as it were, endless diversity as a definition of us will always come to is there a moment when there is such a thing as too much? And I think that the people can sense that, and certainly sense it far better than any political or other class. This word, by the way, populism and populist, I don't buy it myself, I don't use it. I think populist is a term that some people use for things they don't like. It's simply a really good and easy way. I mean, let me give you an example. Monsieur Macron ran without a party, in fact, he formed his own movement, was a one-man show, very charismatic and so on. He's not described as a populist. Why? When Hillary Clinton does the us and them with Wall Street, as she did in her campaign, boasting that she was the only candidate so tough on Wall Street that they actually were fighting against her, who described Hillary Clinton as a populist? If Hillary Clinton had won the election, would it have been a populist win? If Remain had won, would any of one have said this is a populist thing? No.
Is your Prime Minister a populist?
Is our Prime Minister populist? No. I mean, she's the head of the Conservative Party.
But you did hear a definition. You heard a definition from Elif there earlier, which was when it pits itself against the elite. It says we're the real people, the authentic people, against a foreign elite or a distant elite. And particularly, I'm just giving you Elif's definition. If it uses the techniques of democracy to, in some way, once it has power, to either suppress or just restrain democracy and democratic norms.
First of all, the idea of us and them is a derogatory way of describing what, say, the liberal Dutch novelist Paul Scheffer described when he said, in order to make this work, we're going to need a we. We need a we. We need a first-person plural to describe ourselves as a society. And that is just another way of saying, oh, you're just doing us and them. Well, you do need an us. You do need an us. And as I say, I return to this point. If it is the case, Elif's a point that one of the few definitions, or the bits of a definition I could find agreement with, is this thing of, as it were, overstating the power of elites and overstating your own, nascent ability to connect with the people and so on. Well, fine, but sometimes, people aren't onto nothing. If you were to describe a sort of incredibly disjointed, unelected, far, far high above the people and unaccountable to them thing, what could you do better than come up with the European Commission? Is it always populist? Is it always populist to point that out? I would say no. So sometimes people are onto something. But as I say, I think this is just another way of saying, scare quotes around these people. We would like to call them racist, but we're not sure it'll work anymore, and we're nervous, so we'll call them populists.
Lots of people want to come in. Thank you.
Well, firstly, let me just say that there is a narrative, we've heard a little bit of it so far, that the publics of Europe are being led astray by talented demagogues. It's possible as well that the publics of Europe have seen a political class fail to get a grasp of very major things or even talk about them, and that the public have noticed facts. And that it's not that there's a meta-narrative that's going around. There are just facts. There are things that we can see with our eyes. There are things that are clear to us, which politicians daren't tread on. And I've had this experience throughout my life. I never forget the time, many years ago, I think when France first banned the headscarf. I've told this story before, of a Labour MP in a studio with me discussing the rights and wrongs of this, and spent the whole time with me. An Iranian friend of mine was also there, explaining why we were fascist and Islamophobic and so on for defending the French Republic's verdict on the headscarf. And we came out, and this Labour MP patted me on the back and said, "Never forget, Douglas, we're all with you." And I said, "Well, what was that all about on air?" Which was the more pertinent moment. And he said, "Look, I've got a large Muslim constituency and I can't do anything in this area." And that's what you hear all the time in private. And the politicians, when I say this to them, their eyes go huge. They daren't tread onto this. But there's a very straightforward fact, I'm afraid, on this terrorism thing that has to be confronted. Extremism and violence can come from absolutely any community, pretty much. I mean, even Buddhists, when riled up in certain parts of the world, can become violent. The Quakers, I think, we can't go for, but but pretty much every community. So I accept that. This is not something to be picked up on. But Islamic extremism only comes from the Islamic religion and from followers of it. And that is an imported problem for Europe. That's a problem that we've brought in and we're now facing. Now, none of our politicians, by the way, and there's no great conspiracy about this, nobody expected it. If you'd have said to a politician in the 1990s, in the early years of the 2000s, Europe is going to be racked by blasphemy debates, they'd say, "What are you talking about? When did the Spanish Inquisition return?" And then we all became used to it, that there were certain things you couldn't do that were actually blasphemy in a country like this and were punishable effectively by death, by a death sentence. We all accepted that. And now we're told we have to accept the terrorism. Well, maybe we do have to accept the terrorism as part of our life, but the publics have a right to be looking at the politicians and saying, "Look, this is a problem you brought in." It's not only to be talked about. It's not only to be talked about as a problem, but unless we're willing to do that bit of identifying, to my mind, the gap between what the public can see and what the public know, and what the political class is even willing to whisper, will continue to grow, and that's the gap where you have to worry. First of all, sorry, Elif, but the Burkini ban is a massive diversion. A massive diversion. It was a big mistake for the French state when that happened, I agree, but this is not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that just up the road, again, a few days ago, 3 men with machetes went through a London street hacking at people saying this is for Allah. Okay? That's our problem. And this is always the way with this. We always have diversions, and some of these diversions we bring upon ourselves. But let me just get back to the main point. We have had historically massive issues in Europe. Nobody who knows anything about our history wouldn't pretend that. But this is a civil war within a religion which was not our war, and it has become our war. It has become our war, and Elif, you are right and wrong. You are totally wrong to say that there isn't some agreement on this. If you are a Muslim and you follow Islam, you believe that the Quran came from God, and you believe that what is in it is at least very hard to run against. And so now we have a situation in a country like this one, where actually the majority of British Muslims want being gay, like I am, to be made illegal now, okay? So we had a nice liberal agreement in recent decades over being gay, and now you import a community which actually thinks not just that they're not on board with gay marriage, but they think it should be made a lock-upable offence. Where does that come from? It comes from Islam, okay? Where do all these things come from? They come from this, and I'm sorry, but it is a much worse problem than we think. Okay, one poll last year showed that 50% of British Muslims would not go to the police if they knew somebody involved in an ISIS-like group was around them. Another poll showed 2/3 of British Muslims saying they would not go to the police if they knew somebody involved in extremist activity. What the hell are we doing? What the hell are we doing in ignoring that?
Okay, Douglas, let me...
Yeah, but this is so
I know, Elif.
I
will. I'm going to let you come back. I just want to press Douglas on a question because I want to know if we accept what you said, and so obviously a lot of people in this room do, and I think quite a lot don't. I want to know what you do with this sentiment because you have just described an issue, a difference with not just the people who went on a murderous rampage in Borough Market, but with Britain's entire Muslim community, 2 or 3 million people. So what are you actually practically saying? You're saying that this is a faith that didn't exist here before, therefore a problem that didn't exist here before. Are you suggesting these 2 or 3 million British citizens somehow have to now leave the country?
No, of course not. Of course
So
not.
what are you suggesting?
The first thing is you admit this issue and you slow down or stop the flow. The obvious thing, if you've got a problem, admit to it and slow the flow. Okay? The second thing is, obviously, you try to work on the people you have here. Obviously. You can't...
What does work on mean?
Well, you hope that over many, many generations things will change. Of course, the problem we all have is a situation like the case of Salman Abedi. This country gave his parents asylum. They fled from Libya. We gave his parents asylum. Now we're working out what his parents actually believed. But actually, then 2 weeks ago, their son goes into a Manchester arena and blows up 22 people, one for every year of life this country gave him. So we could be in a situation where we're saying, okay, the first generation are fine, but we've no idea what their children are going to do. And I would very quickly make this point.
Really quickly,
if you want to see the depth of this problem and a possible solution, see who the most vilified people in the Muslim community in this country, they are the reformers. Every single case, it's the reformers. Okay, and one of the London Bridge attackers last year attacked an imam who's a friend of mine in London. Okay, everybody knows this. The reformers are on the edge of this, and this is the point.
Okay.
The reformers may lose, and that used to be a big tragedy for the Islamic world, and now it's a tragedy for Britain. First of all, of course, we've got to remember that we've been talking about asylum a lot, and certainly now the people coming into southern Europe, certainly the Italian points of entry, are not asylum seekers in the way that we're seeing. They're not Syrians. They are economic migrants looking for a better life, and that has always, in recent years, been a massive part of this. And these two things are constantly elided, deliberately elided, and I think dangerously elided. So yes, I could well get on board with a religious test. For instance, in recent years, there has been a significant genocide on our continent, on our planet, rather. Yazidis, who were almost wiped out a couple of years ago. I could certainly get on board with something that prioritized asylum seekers if they're Yazidis, or Coptic Christians.
I can see what you're doing. I can see what you're doing there, Douglas, and that's good. What I'm saying is, would you want a religious test that didn't prioritise Yazidis? Everyone finds that admirable, but would actually rule out and prevent Muslims from granting entry into this country?
I can't see the sense in keeping a high level of economic migration from the Muslim world. No.
So yes, a religious test to prevent Muslim migrants.
Secondly, very quickly, the gentleman at the back from Germany. First of all, it's not the case that it's been fine with Turkish migration since the Gastarbeiter period. Merkel herself said in 2010 that it had been a disaster. Then 5 years later, she made the disaster far bigger. But, you know, in 2008, Erdogan went to Germany and spoke to tens of thousands of Turks in Europe from the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, and said at a massive public rally, do not integrate, but get involved in politics because we need you. I'm sorry, this is subversion. This is outright subversion of European democracies. So yes, we had a problem. And as for the, as it were, would it matter if 1 in 1 million became a suicide bomber? Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? As long as you're not the one standing outside the wine bar in Ansbach when the suicide bomber goes off, it might be okay for you. It might be okay, and it seems to be for most people in our political parties in Britain, it might be okay for you to not worry about this identity question, not worry about the numbers, but you've just got to hope your kids don't like Ariana Grande and go on the wrong night. But I think the cost-benefit analysis of this has to be weighed up, and if you do think that, then say it. Say, we'll take a suicide bombing every now and then. We'll take the stabbings every now and then. Sure. We'll be very surprised if, in the wake of increased terror attacks, the British people thought it was best to put their security in the hands of Mr. Corbyn.
So that means you do think there's an outcome?
Very quickly, well, there have only been 2 groups of people in recent years who've tried to blow up the British people, the IRA and Islamists. And one of the very few things that, that links them is the support of Mr. Corbyn. I hope the British people will make their voice heard on that. Very quickly, look, all of this stuff is part of what the point of my book is to try to look at the deeper things underneath this. Our continent is racked by guilt, it's racked by tiredness, existential exhaustion, a whole range of things that mean we are very vulnerable to anyone who comes along and says it's our fault. We're very vulnerable to it, and it's, I have to say, high time we snapped out of it. When I was last on the Greek islands, the reception islands at the camps where migrants were coming in, you know, I was speaking to people from such a wide range of countries. Bangladesh, for instance. What's this country done to Bangladesh recently that should be a reason for us to be continuing to take in people from that country? And what's your solution if people who think that? You can't solve Syria. What are you going to do to solve Eritrea? And you think that in the meantime, we have to continue the current wave of migration. It's madness. Very quickly, to the Scandinavian countries, I don't buy it. All happiness studies are bunk. Total bunk. They always say that the best thing to be is a hill farmer in Bhutan. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. And it's the same with Scandinavia.